What's going on, everyone? My name is Jose, and welcome back to another episode of the J Area Podcast. This is a podcast where I discuss some of my favorite films and analyze them for their significance. And this week's episode, we will be covering Stanley Kubrick's film, The Shining, which was released May 23rd, 1980. It is based on the Stephen King novel from 1977 of the same name, and Stephen King still to this day even criticizes the film for the differences from the book and the film itself. But I'm a firm believer that The Shining itself is one of the all-time great films to have ever been produced. Regardless of one's opinion on its deviations from the novel, I think the direction that Stanley Kubrick in terms of visual and thematic scale, I think it's one of the best films to have ever been made. The plot itself follows a family heading to an isolated hotel for the winter where a sinister presence influences the father into violence, while his psychic son sees horrific forebodings from both past and future. A little bit of a quick backstory and production in terms of how the film was made, but Stanley Kubrick had his staff bring him a stack of horror books to read in hopes of finding a new film to make. Now, Stanley Kubrick's secretary had heard the sound of each book hitting the wall as the director flung it into a reject pile after reading the first few pages. Finally, there was one day that a secretary noticed that it had been a while since she had heard a thud of another writer's book biting the dust. That same secretary would then check on Kubrick and see that he was deeply engrossed in reading one of the copies of The Shining. See, with the likes of Stanley Kubrick, he had to really be invested in what he was going to make a film about. So to have him start reading through the first few pages of the manuscript of The Shining, and having him being able to invest in the characters, invest in the story, and really being able to share that of a cabin fever / ghost story with audiences really intrigued him. But before he would cast the likes of Jack Nicholson, there were other individuals who were in consideration for the role of Jack Torrance. For example, individuals like Robert De Niro, Robin Williams, Harrison Ford, and even Martin Sheen were all in consideration for that role. However, when it came to filming, there was a lot of speculation and accusations that the filming conditions weren't really the best. In fact, this film itself kind of had a long-last effect on Shelley Duvall. For her, it was a very long shoot. In fact, for many members of the crew, it was a very long work days, and they didn't really get along with Stanley Kubrick, specifically Duvall. This would lead to many arguments between the two. He would criticize her acting techniques, and they would argue over the lines. In fact, Duvall wasn't the only one that had issues with the lines, as Jack Nicholson would become so frustrated with these rewrites that he would just throw away the newest copies, as he knew that they would eventually be changed again. Nicholson would learn to just memorize his lines minutes before shooting the scene, as a way to just prepare himself. But a lot of the stories really involved Duvall, as she became so overwhelmed and worked by the stress that she would begin to feel ill for months, and even lose her hair at one point. But that's really what The Shining focuses on. They focus on the story of how these three individuals, this one family, is affected by the Overlook Hotel, and how 5 months in isolation really plays with one's mind. Each individual character has their own characteristics and what makes them different from one another, but also in terms of their level of patience and their mental tolerance. For example, there's Jack Nicholson, who plays Jack Torrance, who is an aspiring writer and a former school teacher, and he's taking advantage of the 5 months for a writing project. It's also mentioned that he's a recovering alcoholic, and there's accusations of him abusing Danny when he was younger. Speaking of his son Danny, he's played by Danny Lloyd, who actually has some visions and what is called The Shining in this film. Hence the title of the film, The Shining. And as for his mother, Wendy Torrance, she enjoys scary stories and movies, and she's really portrayed as a caring and kind woman who abides by her husband and just wants to make her son and husband happy at the end of the day. Over the course of the film, we are able to see the changes in personality and preferences that these three individuals go through. Although the most drastic changes that we see are in Jack Torrance, but it's always interesting to see over the course of a film how the environment of the Overlook Hotel influences all three individuals. And the Overlook Hotel in itself is a character as well, as it has its own personality, and throughout the film, it expresses its own emotion through the characters or the ghosts that some people like to refer it to. Upon looking over the Overlook Hotel, there are many beautiful shots, long shots of the hotel demonstrating how large in scale it actually is. Wendy even describes it as a maze, and there are certain instances where she makes references to breadcrumbs that she might lose her way along the course of the hotel itself. A lot of interesting notes that some viewers point out is the door placements and oddities around the hotel. For example, the way it is constructed and built, there are certain areas and certain corners where there are doors, but they may lead to nowhere. And it's just a nice little play that Stanley Kubrick has on the audience's perception of what the overall hotel looks like. And over the course of the film, the more we get comfortable with the building itself, it's almost as if he's playing with our minds and trying to influence how we view the hotel itself, almost questioning ourselves as to, was that door really there? Where does this door lead to? And why is this room this size or positioned in this certain way? There's a lot of fading transition to the hotel and to the maze itself, which I think is a nice way to kind of connect the two between one another, because the hotel itself is just a large maze with so many rooms and so many floors throughout the hotel. And Jack oversees the maze model at one point in the film, and it's just a really nice metaphor for how he's also overseeing the hotel itself. But the maze on the outside, it plays a big factor not only in the ending, but just the overall theme of the film itself, and it's finding yourself. How does one find themselves before they are eventually lost? And I think that's the big balance between the two dynamics that are Danny and his mother Wendy versus that of Jack Torrance. Throughout the course of this film, we really see a descent into madness that is Jack Torrance. It's a tale of cabin fever for some, it's a ghost story for others, but for me personally, I've always seen The Shining as a tale of cabin fever. It demonstrates how Jack Torrance is going through a slow descent into madness. Originally into the film, and at the beginning of the film I should say, Jack is portrayed as an ordinary man, but states that he was immediately infatuated with the hotel. He was drawn to it. He felt more and more at home than any other place, almost as if he'd been there, almost as if he belonged there. About a month into it, he begins to lose it, and there's an instance where he displays some anger towards Wendy. It's when he's typing in the large corridor room, and he raises his voice at her, asking her to leave the room, and it's really the first instance that we see him losing his concentration, losing his patience. Upon that, 2 days later go by, and it's that one shot of Jack Nicholson just staring deeply past the camera, and you can see he's starting to grow out his beard, his hair's becoming more disheveled, and he's really becoming that more and more of a hermit-looking type of character. Of course, there's also the scene where Danny wants to get the fire truck from the hotel room, and Jack positions him onto his lap, and he begins to talk to Danny, and he assures him that he would never do anything to hurt his family. And because of those actions, and just the tone in his voice, and you can see it in his eyes, his actions become more and more stranger. And it's in this scene that we are told, this dialogue through that of a mirror, and the importance of mirrors and doubles. We'll get into it in a little bit, but it's important to notice just small details like that. Of course, I would be remiss by mentioning mirrors and not talking about the gold room scene, where Jack Torrance is talking to Lloyd at the bar. You see, Jack Nicholson's character finally gets away from his family, and he's going into the gold room, and it's almost as if he's playing tricks on his own mind, and he's pretending he's at the bar and in a party, and is talking to Lloyd. And either Lloyd is depicted as a ghost or a figment of Jack's imagination, but Jack seems so comfortable with him at the bar, almost as if it is a direct reflection of Jack himself. Now, for many, they would believe that it's a ghost, but like I said, I look at this film as a tale of cabin fever. And what cabin fever is when one individual is enclosed and isolated in one location for so long. Obviously, a cabin in the woods during a snowstorm is one of the more popular examples. And it only demonstrates that the longer an individual stays in an enclosed area, their mind begins to play tricks on them. It's also in this scene that Jack is imagining himself drinking again and delving back into the vices of alcoholism. Also, after this scene, Wendy comes in and is telling Jack about room 237 and how there's a woman that laid her hands on Danny and he has bruising on him, something she accused Jack earlier in the film, but has now come to realize that there's someone else in this hotel. And what I find very ironic about this scene is this is taking place after Jack is talking to Lloyd and having this whole grand conversation with someone that he believes is in the room with him. But upon hearing this story from his wife Wendy, he looks her dead in the eye and says, "Are you out of your freaking mind?" And I just find that so ironic that here he is talking to himself and beginning to lose himself in the hotel, diving more and more into insanity, while his wife here is clearly seeing bruising on her son's arms, and she's the one that's losing it. So I find that very ironic and very interesting choice of direction, not only by Stanley Kubrick, but I'm assuming Stephen King as well, as he wrote the novel. And speaking of writing, there's one scene that it really stands out for many of us watching this film, and that's upon when Wendy is going throughout the hotel, and she's really going through that final circuit of a horror film that everyone knows when everything becomes revealed to the audience. But she had come across the typewriter that Jack has been using throughout the course of this film, and she realizes that it's just one phrase typed over and over again over all these pages, and it's all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, which is just a frightening idea when you really get down to the nitty-gritty of it. And that's this whole time he's been dedicated himself and his time to typing out this novel, but it's just been this one phrase over and over again, just demonstrating that sense of losing it and falling into a sense of madness and insanity. And not only is it a play on what's occurring in the film itself, but all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy demonstrates how, almost as if a pencil, the more you use a sharp pencil, it becomes duller. So Jack, when he's first introduced in this film, is really portrayed as a sharp individual. He's smart, he's intelligent, he was a teacher. And over the course of this film, he's becoming more dull and just losing that sense of purpose, losing that sense of focus, which is very similar to that of a pencil. When it becomes overworked and worn out, it becomes dull. And then, as I previously mentioned, there is an importance of mirrors throughout the course of this film. And again, the talk between Ghost and Cabin Fever. But whenever there is an instance that Jack is talking to an apparition or figment of his imagination, there's always a mirror present when Jack is seeing something. And again, it's one's own interpretation as to whether it is Ghost or it's Jack reflecting on himself and his own psyche as well as his demons. But the idea of mirrors doesn't just stop there. It's also the idea of doubles. Throughout the course of this film, there's a lot of references to that of the double identity or double just in general, as the Grady twins are consistently shown throughout the hotel and in the visions that Danny experiences. There's the use of reflections, as I mentioned. It's a way of Jack Torrance really looking within as to his own psyche and his own demons, as I mentioned. There's the seeing double of alcohol, as it's very common for those who consume alcohol to have double vision, and throughout the course of this film, it is experienced and explored that Jack Torrance may have suffered from alcoholism in the early stages of his marriage. And then, of course, how about Danny and his own imaginary friend Tony, being, again, two personalities in one person. And just a quick shout out to Danny Lloyd, the young actor who would play Danny Torrance. He does a wonderful job, not unlike what we saw in Andy Barclay from Alex Vincent's portrayal in the Child's Play film. These young actors are really able to capture that sense of dread and drama that is needed to further the plot of this film. And I think Danny himself is a main character, not only in the face of this franchise, but just in horror in general. When you talk about some of the more popular younger actors for films, I think you have to look at a guy like Alex Vincent from Child's Play. Of course, there's the girl from Poltergeist. We have Reagan from The Exorcist. I think Danny Lloyd is up there as well in terms of one of the best portrayals of a young child in a horror film, especially when you see the different dynamic between him and his mother and father. I go back to the idea of the maze and how it demonstrates one losing themselves in the process. But there's also a difference in the way that Danny and Jack go through a maze versus that of Danny and Wendy. We see early on in the film, Danny and his mother going throughout the maze just as a little bit of fun to pass the time, and they reach the middle of the maze and learning where it ends. Of course, they eventually find their way back. But then you also compare it to that of the hotel and how when they're running away from Jack, that too is also a maze that they have to navigate throughout in order to escape and survive, essentially, throughout this whole ordeal. Versus that of Danny and his father, Jack, when Jack is chasing him throughout the maze at the end of the film, Jack loses his way, and Danny is able to outsmart Jack by laying out his footprints, but also wiping them away so that Jack loses him in the process. But it's also because Danny had gone through the maze originally with his mother, and it's another nice parallel to that of the tale of Hansel and Gretel. Again, going back to how the witch is chasing after the two. And again, there's the whole comparison of the breadcrumbs that are left for the children and that of the breadcrumbs comment made by Wendy early on in the film. But again, the maze itself is also a nice test of mental strength for all characters involved. Danny, who goes through the maze with his mother early on has already have that sense of familiarity and has tested himself not only through that maze, but there's also the scene in the film where he's riding his little bike, and it's just going through the halls of the Overlook Hotel. Again, becoming more familiar with his surroundings and finding different ways to hit a corner or to hide away and eventually just escape from his father. But being that Jack hides himself away and is continuing to just work himself to death essentially by typing all the time or going up to the room and just losing himself in the gold room, he's not able to keep a sharp mind. He's not able to maintain that sharp presence to be able to distinguish what is fact and what is fiction. And in doing so, because he's doing nothing but work and not being able to play around with his son and explore the hotel as Danny does, all work and no play truly does make Jack a dull boy because he loses that sharp sense of his surroundings. So he's not able to navigate throughout the hotel the way his son does, essentially. And I would certainly be remiss to not mention the iconic scene towards the end of the film where Jack Nicholson is hacking down the door with an axe. And originally, the door that Jack had to break down was actually a fake door. They had a prop door. But being that Jack was an actual volunteer firefighter at one point, he was able to knock down the door with ease. So they ended up putting up a real door for him to knock down just to add more dramatic effect and stretch out the scene itself. And then the line, "Here's Johnny," is a direct reference to that of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, a line that Jack Nicholson actually improvised. And the scene itself is just so well done as it's able to have such a dramatic effect on not only the film, but the audience is really resonating with that of Wendy, and how with each hack it's becoming increasingly more dangerous and more frightening that Jack is going to enter that room, and Lord knows what he's going to do to her and Danny. And it's just the timing of each swing and the musical cue that Kubrick uses throughout this scene. Again, it's no wonder why this scene stands the test of time as one of the greatest scenes in cinema history. But not only that, a lot of folks look at that scene as one of the more hair-raising and terrifying scenes of the film. But what I think is more frightening is that of that final circuit that Wendy has to go through, and she's running throughout the halls and encountering different spirits of the hotel itself. That's when the hotel really comes alive. And there are certain elements and certain scenes and characters that might not make 100% sense to, the average viewer. And I feel like the less we know, the scarier it is. Less is more when it comes to horror. I always use the example of the shark from Jaws, because the less you see of the shark, you're able to develop your own imagination as to what it would look like and what would happen. And that in itself is scary enough for audiences to gain some kind of fright. But not only that, you also have to consider how Wendy, as well as Shelley, the actress, had endured so much during the filming of this film, as well as what was going on in the film. It's a comparison between the actress and the character she is portraying, as they are tormented and haunted, absolutely drained over the course of this film. And you can see that in this final scene, that she's running throughout the halls, just absolutely drained and terrified. And it's the culmination of what this film has been building and building on with each scene that they are in. The Shining itself has to be one of the more popular films in terms of analyzing. It's one of the most analyzed films probably ever made. And nothing is analyzed more than like that final picture that is shown at the end of the movie, where it's the photograph of Jack Torrance in a party that states July 4th, 1921. And it raises the question as to, is he reincarnated or is he absorbed into the hotel itself? The picture has always been there. It's been there the whole time. So how is it that no one had noticed it? Or is it simply a figment of his imagination? I mean, Grady does mention how Jack has always been the caretaker. So there is that sense of, is it reincarnation? But then Jack has always had this sense of belonging and comfort in the hotel, as he mentioned when he first arrived. So it's up to one's interpretation. I personally believe he was absorbed into the hotel. I believe that his essence was always there at the hotel. And it's just a retelling. But the character himself of Jack Torrance is a tormented soul that has to endure 5 months in isolation with his son and his wife and no other individual. And over the course, he is tasked with caretaking for this hotel, as well as aspiring to write his own novel. but his psyche isn't strong enough to handle this isolation. So over the course of these 5 months and the course of this film, we really see the breakdown of what Jack Torrance endures. This is a film that everyone has an opinion on, and I find it very chilling that towards the end, again, you have to question, is it that of a cautionary tale of cabin fever, or is it that of a ghost story? For me personally, it's my favorite Jack Nicholson portrayal, as I've always really enjoyed seeing characters, how they fall from grace, how they end up in one spot, and over the course of certain events, and over the course of this film, what are some instances that influence them to fall into this sense of madness, where they are no longer who we knew them as once, but they are now something entirely different. I've always find those character studies interesting as to how that descent, that fall, can be so dramatic and so traumatizing for these characters. And in his case, Jack Nicholson ended up losing it to the point where he was going to attack his son and his wife. Of course, he wasn't able to, as the two were able to evade his attacks, and he's eventually lost in the maze and is frozen to death. But with that being said, again, it looks like he was absorbed into the hotel and will forever be there and encompassed in time with the Overlook Hotel. As we bring this episode to a close, I just wanted to go ahead and reiterate that I think The Shining is one of the greatest films to ever be produced, regardless of what Stephen King believes. Of course, a lot of films are going to deviate from its source material in order to provide an original take on the source material. I think what Stanley Kubrick is able to do, not only visually but also story-wise with these characters, is something that can be studied and has been studied for years to come. I think the film itself does a wonderful job in highlighting what an average ordinary family has to endure when they are closed in a haunted location, if you will. And I think The Shining is certainly up there with some of the greatest psychological horror films of all time. Of course, a lot of folks like to point at modern films like Midsommar and Hereditary, but I will 100% take The Shining over those any day. And nothing to take away from those other films that I mentioned, but I just find The Shining in its simplicity, but also its complexity, as it dives into themes and theories that I didn't even touch upon. But for those who know the film and know its history, there is such a deep dive that can be made when covering The Shining itself. It's certainly a film that I would recommend to any movie fan and to any horror fan as well. And with that being said, next week's episode will be a special one, as we will discuss 1978's Halloween, the film that inspired so many other slasher films, as well as a franchise that would carry on for nearly 50 years to this day. It will also conclude our coverage of films for the Halloween season, as we approach November, I wanted to let you guys know about some changes to the podcast. Following next week's Halloween episode, the J Area Podcast will be releasing episodes every other Monday. So you will be able to listen to each one of these episodes either on Spotify or even on YouTube. I'm really trying to push the YouTube channel, so along with each individual episode, I will be uploading more shorts, as those have proven to be quite successful. But regardless, I am always appreciative and grateful for the support. And if you haven't already, please make sure to like this, follow, and subscribe to the podcast for more movie content. And as always, my name is Jose. This has been the J Area Podcast, and I will see you guys for the next episode.